This is GIS 311 LabX, a preparatory lab to get students started with data management and ArcMap. This is part 3 of LabX. This video is going to be a little bit different than parts 1 and 2. I won't be reading verbatim, but rather I'll be going through and completing all the skills and doing this quite live, for example, meaning that there will be mistakes, which will hopefully show that everybody makes mistakes and we can just fix those mistakes. There may be some edits because this lab was written for, I believe, 10.2, and now we're working in 10.7. It's been updated a little bit, but just as heads up, there will be some edits. There might be some stopping, some little changing of directions to make things work, all in the interest of helping students get through their own LabX when they join the class next week. As a refresher, let's scroll back a little bit. We've already used the snipping tool to create some snips. We've used the print screen. Moving back a little bit further, we've started a directory. We've created our GIS 311 directory, and we've also created a labs folder, I believe, as well as a helpful files folder. We've learned to not have wasted space in our screenshot, rather making it look like this. So let's move on with step 3, which begins with finally opening ArcMap. I can't show you on the screen because of the position of my video, but we'll start ArcMap by going to Windows. Currently we're working in 10.7.1. We'll go to ArcGIS and then ArcMap. And already there's a change. I added a step 2 to GIS and a step 3 to ArcMap. Most students should be able to figure this out. So we'll open GIS, ArcMap. And as this is opening, notice it's 10.7.1 for this video. It might be a little different in later years, but there's going to be some differences in how we log into ArcMap. Some students will be using the Windows button on the bottom of the screen. Other students will be remoting in first, and I'm going to click cancel here. ArcMap getting started. I'm just going to click cancel, and I'm going to click don't show this dialog again. This is in the directions too. No new students will have these maps. Yours will be blank, but for now I'm going to turn this off and click cancel. And now we have the normal ArcMap screen with an untitled map. As I was saying, students will be using a virtual private network, some of them, and remoting into the computer labs, which will be a little bit of a different process, and that'll be taught in class live during our course sessions or watched via recording for students that watch it later that can't make the synchronous session. So there's a BP client, big IP client. I'll show you here. This is what we use at UW. We have directions available for students to log in to the UW campus. And then from there, there's one more process that students are provided for them to get in. But for now, just know that students will need to do the big IP edge client. We call this Husky OnNet. That's our branded name. They'll need to get this connected first and then move to the remote login. And again, directions are provided. So I'm going to minimize this now and get back to the directions. As noted earlier, I'm not going to show the directions all that much. Students will have a copy of these directions, and that they'll just distract from the screen. It'll be easier for students to see what's going on, listen to me talk through it, and have the directions open on a separate screen or on a different device to scroll through as they're completing this lab. So this is a refresher or an introduction, so to speak, for LabX. Students will be completing this exact lab. So there are no secrets. I'm showing exactly what needs to be done. The issue is that students need to complete it, and they always do. And this works out to be a great introduction, gets them well set up for doing our first official lab, which is Lab 1, labs with a number. As mentioned, we click the intro screen, the getting started screen, and this is how ArcMap usually opens up. Sometimes there's catalog over here on the right, sometimes the toolbox is there, but let's go through it. There are many required steps that you must take when starting a new map. For now, I'm just going to list the most important items for LabX, and that'll start by adding some toolbars. So let's add the certain toolbars by going to Customize, Toolbars, and let's make sure that we have the drawing toolbar and that is turned on. And you cannot see that, which is unfortunate, but the drawing toolbar is on. Let me scroll. So I've turned on the drawing toolbar. The layout toolbar should be on, which it is. The effects, I'll turn that one on, and notice the effects comes right here. I'll just let me show that again. You grab the gray area and just drag it somewhere. So I'm dragging it up to my toolbar. Let's look for the standard toolbar, which is there. The tools toolbar, which is already on. Looks like a lot of them started. And in the directions, it'll show that where the draw toolbar is that you can't see on the video. The next major step, we're going to add catalog, Arc Toolbox, and search to the right side of the screen. You can see that my screen right now already has catalog showing. Sometimes it shows up, sometimes it doesn't when you first open ArcMap. We'll use catalog from the right side of the screen to create a set of folders within our GIS Labs directory of our GIS 311 overall directory for LabX and for all labs in GIS 311. If you forget how to do these steps, students can refer back to the original LabX directions anytime, or of course be rewatching this video. Moving on. Remember, it's important that in GIS that we maintain an uncluttered and organized storage system for our maps and our data. There are many ways to do this, and there's a number of ways to do it incorrectly. At UW, what I do is teach one method and require that students use it for 3 of the classes so that we're all doing the exact same process and it's easier to help each other out. There are other ways to manage your data. This just happens to work out to be a simple method of keeping our data separate from our maps within an overall lab folder. Before we start to create our folders, it's important to remember that I've been talking about these things to do every time you start a map, or perhaps every time you start ArcMap. With remoting into the lab computers, you never know which computer you're going to get, so students may find themselves resetting up their ArcMap interface, making this look like I did by adding those certain folders or turning off that first splash screen, even the catalog and toolbox showing up. There is no way to guarantee that you remote into the same machine each time. Those students with their own computers or borrowed computers that they use at home, they should keep some of these settings, but it's important to always check that when you start a map and start a project with ArcMap, that you verify all of these settings, whether you have a computer at home or you're remoting in, and we'll see that in the next few steps. There could be a big long discussion about relative path names, but I'm going to keep it as simple as possible and just say that the processes that I've developed with having a maps folder and a data folder combined with a specific checkbox in the map document properties called store relative path names to data sources will keep things working for us. So one of the very first steps, every single map, every single time, we go to File, Map Document Properties, and we need to check down here in Path Names, store relative path names to data sources. What that does is it tells Arc that when you open a map to look and I'm simplifying this, but to look for a data folder close to the map folder. In other words, don't look for the actual C drive. And I can use this screen as an example. If I were to use this C drive to store my data, I'm not, but if I was, and I sent this map to somebody, there is no way that they would have a C drive users with my user ID to find the data. ArcMap is different in that the data isn't technically in the map. There is a path to the data, and the data needs to be connected. And it's connected by this imaginary line or path to the data sources, which was why we say store relative path names. So we'll be looking for a data LX when we have layers in our maps, rather than looking for C users user ID documents. We're going backwards, so we'll be looking towards the right end of the path, or Arc will, to find the data if we check store relative path names. Cannot emphasize enough that this will be one of the first errors that students make, and what will happen is there will be a blank map if students do not click this button. So it's important to remember it. And that's where I suggest students make a written or digital note of all of these initial steps so they can use them as a checklist until they've memorized them. Moving along, for every map we do in GIS, in 311, 312, or 414, we must enter a title, summary, description, author, credits, and tags. So I am going to do that now, and feel free to fast forward the video as I type or not. We'll just call this Greg's Lab X Map. For a summary, I'm just going to type in the very first sentence of the lab description. We must also enter a description. I'm going to copy the description, the entire paragraph from the lab directions, because it's a great description of our lab, and simply paste it in. For the author, add my name. For credits, we should reference where we received the data. For this lab, I'm just going to type GIS 311 Lab X Data. Tags, should always add some appropriate tags, so we'll try GIS 311, UWT, all separated by a comma, and School of Urban Studies. We do not use a hyperlink base, and please remember we're using store relative path names to data sources. We're not going to talk about a default geodatabase at this time. We're going to leave the rest of the items as they are. Click apply and OK, or just OK. Either one would have worked. The second pre-mapping step is to change the name of the data frame. And you may be wondering what a data frame is, but this is the data frame. This is called layers at this time. We're going to change it by clicking on it once slowly and then once again, and we're going to change this to Lab X Data Frame. This will come into play later in the lab and future labs, because we'll have multiple data frames. And I can show you just right now quickly, if we wanted a new data frame, it would be insert data frame, but that's not part of this lab. But we could have multiple data frames. Notice this is the only time that spaces are allowed. So there are spaces in my data frame name. The next step would be to save the map, but we haven't quite created the folders for this map to be stored yet. So this is the one and only time that we don't save the map at this step. But it should be remembered that we will save the first map as quite literally user ID lab X blank with appropriate underscores. So I would go in, save as, and find the right folder, user ID lab X blank, because it's a blank map. For now, we're not going to save. This is the only time. And then as a precursor to the end of the lab, several pages from now. At the end, when you're done with your final map, you always save in GIS 311, 312, and 414, capital AAA, which helps the map float to the top of your maps folder, underscore user ID, underscore lab, underscore the number of the lab, in this case X, underscore final. And that lets me know which map you'd like graded, the teacher to grade. It also, again, floats it to the top of your maps folder. Sometimes you'll have many maps within your maps folder. And 99% of the time, you might have 10, 15, 20 maps or MXDs in your maps folder, and I'll just be looking at the final map. You can call your other maps whatever you'd like. Sometimes in the lab, I give you names of suggested names for the map that you're saving. Sometimes I use the step number. For example, right now we're on step 11.2, so I would save it as user ID labx underscore 11 underscore 2. Remember, no periods or funky characters or spaces. In ArcMap, determine by looking to see if you have a catalog on the right side of your screen. I do have catalog. If I did not, I'm going to close it now. So this is what it would look like without it. If you ever lose catalog, you can hover on the icons to find it. I happen to know that this was catalog, and you can click to open catalog. And it will dock itself on the side of your screen, if that's where it was before. It may come looking like this. So it could be floating. In which case you grab the blue bar, in my case it's blue, click and hold your mouse, and as soon as you move your mouse, there are 8 different places that you can dock it. There's this docking that I often use, and also this docking. For now, I'm just going to dock it to the right, like that. Now that I've got it docked, it doesn't need to be that big. I can shrink it and click out. At this point, the pin is pointing down, so the catalog is locked open. I can choose to auto hide by clicking the pin so that it points to the left, and it even says auto hide when I hover, or I can dock it. I like to keep it open when I'm using it, so I'll leave it as it is right now. And in this case, my window is very small for the video. You should most likely, I would recommend making your ArcMap window much bigger so that there's a lot more mapping space. We'll call this the mapping space. This is the table of contents, and this is the catalog area. We are also going to add the toolbox there as well. I'm going to use my mouse to hover in the catalog area and show you some of the what the icons do. And you can do the same, follow along. There's the go back, go forward to the sequence of locations that you visited in the catalog. You can go up one level. You can go to the home folder, the default geodatabase, choose contents panel view, connect to folder. We'll be using this one very soon. Toggle the contents panel. Then this toggles between seeing the catalog tree and the contents panel together, or just the tree. And then at the end there is options. First thing we're going to do is connect to a folder. And this is how we get our data into the map. We connect to a folder. In this, you are likely looking at 0 folder connections. This is probably expanded, or if not, you can expand it by clicking on the plus to make it a minus. I have several folder connections, and the folder connections are denoted by the tiny arrow that points in on the folder. These are connections. These aren't actual folders. So this is a connection to my D folder, but this, without the arrow, is my actual folder. On a folder connection, I can disconnect the folder without anything happening. If I were to right click and choose delete, I quite literally would delete this entire folder, which is everything to do with GIS for me on my computer. Students have done this in the past, so please never right click and delete. If anything, you should be going in and disconnecting a folder. And we'll get further into this as we start creating our own connections. And then removing connections. For now, let's connect to a folder. We connect to a folder and we get the connect to folder window. Do not simply click OK. It should be noted that this is not the actual folder. This is a connection to the folder. Think of it as a shortcut to the folder. We'll create a lot of these. The first one you created is to the root of the storage device. That is the disk drive. But it is still just a connection. It is not the actual data. We will now create a few more folder connections. The reason is convenience. Some people like to have a folder connection right to the root. That way you can use just one. Other people like to drill down into the directory and specify certain labs or even the data folder. Let's start to create some more by clicking on the folder connection button. Note, if you hover, it says connect to folder. And we're going to navigate again to our storage device. Here's our storage device, but we are not creating that connection. We already created that one. Yours again is a different letter. This time we're going to point to our directory, and that is right here, my GIS Spring 2020 directory. I will now create a folder connection to that directory. By clicking OK, it'll pop up in my list. And it has right here, GIS 311 Spring 2020 directory. It should now be easy to create a connection to your GIS 311 Labs folder. So I'm going to do so, create a connection to my GIS 311 Labs, and it shows up right there. I'm going to show you that these are just connections. You notice that within my D I have my directory. If I open my directory, I have my labs folder, and within my labs folder there is not yet anything. If I go down below to a different connection, this time to the Spring 2020 directory, which is right here, this is the actual folder. If I open up the directory, I see the exact same thing. Helpful files and labs. Helpful files and labs. And going one further, if I open the labs folder, notice that it's GIS 311 Labs. It is empty, just as this one is empty. So these are just different connections to the same data. If I were to remove this helpful files folder, it would be removed from here, and it would be removed from any other place that we could visualize it on the screen. And we've run into a case where I can open this up a little bit more to see student work Spring 2020. Notice as the D's get longer, it's harder to see, whereas my D works pretty well because I can open the D, I can open my directory and still have my helpful files and my labs. Whereas with my folder connection right to the labs, it's starting to get cut off. So I'm losing some mapping real estate by having to open this up so that this fits. This window gets smaller. And that'll be just a personal preference that you'll get used to what type of folder connection you like to use. And that'll develop as you work through the labs. Our next step is to create a lab folder. And this is in fact your lab folder for everything that is LabX. This is the house that everything for LabX goes in. It should be noted this folder that we're about to create, LabX, is not the one that you submit. Again, this is LabX and it's everything for LabX, but it's not the one you should submit. We're going to create several more folders afterwards, and I will emphasize which of those should be zipped up and submitted. In this case, you'll create the specific lab directory, and it is LabX, but you will create directories like this for every lab throughout the rest of the quarter. We should now navigate to our GIS 311 Labs folder because that's where we'd like to create the LabX. There are 3 spots to do so. I could right click in this area to create a LabX, which will create a LabX in 311 Labs. I could right click in this 311 Labs, which is the identical spot. It's just a second listing of it. Or here is 311 Labs in its own folder connection. I could create LabX here. So this being the bottom one of my list, just happen to choose, I'm going to right click and choose New Folder. And a new folder is created within 311 Labs. It is not yet showing in this 311 Labs or this 311 Labs, but it will in a moment. The trick is just to name your folder as you create it, so you don't have to click the delete key or the backspace key. And because I paused the video in doing this, I will delete this folder just for the, and notice it's just a new folder, so it's empty. I'm going to delete it and show you again by clicking on New Folder. And now with it highlighted blue, I don't have to type delete, I don't have to backspace, I can just type LAB_X. And from there, I will click on the Enter key. And now my LabX has been created. It doesn't appear that it's showing up in GIS 311 Labs here nor here, but we will make it so that it does show up. Let's make the LabX show up where it should be in the other 311 Lab folders. In this folder, it's not showing, it's showing empty, but if we right click and refresh, a plus appears and we can find the LabX. It's not showing in this folder, but we know it's there because it's the exact same folder. We can simply refresh. Another method is to simply refresh the entire folder or folder connection. So I could refresh this folder right here, or I could refresh the entire connection. So let's try to refresh the entire connection, open up my directory, labs, and there is a LabX. That is an important skill to remember. You must right click and refresh to see some of your folders and or files. It may appear that they're not there, but they're likely there. You just need to refresh. In the next step, we're going to create a user ID lab folder within the LabX folder. This is a very important folder. You will have a user ID folder for every lab this quarter. Right click on any of the LabX folders and create a new folder. Name this folder your user ID _ lab _ X. I did user ID _ lab _ X. It should be noted, because it has happened, please make sure that you did not label your folder as GWLGIS, nor that you labeled it with USERID. Make sure you're using your user ID. The next thing about this folder is this is the one that you will eventually submit to the zip Dropbox for each individual lab. You will always in Windows right click on your user ID lab folder and compress it. You never compress the LabX folder, always the user ID folder, and the reasons for that will be explained later. But get this, just to start the thought process, you'll be zipping up or compressing your user ID LabX folder. I will now guide you through creating two more folders that belong within the user ID LabX folder. We need a data folder to hold data and a maps folder to hold maps. To create it within this user ID folder, I'll right click, new folder, and name it data LX, and that stands for LabX. To create a maps folder, right click, new folder, maps, capital M A P S underscore capital L capital X. You'll use a capital letter on D and M for data and maps, a capital L for to designate lab, and then the number. In this case, the number is an X. And I can click in the mapping window to get out of the renaming of that. Notice that they may or may not be in here. Right now we're missing maps, but if I refresh, maps shows up. And here we're still missing maps. I click refresh and maps appears. Yours should look nearly identical with the exception of your user ID. You'll have labs, LabX, user ID, data, and maps. Notice the indentations. On your own, create a raw data LX. So that's capital R, capital A, capital W, underscore, capital D, lowercase ATA, underscore LX within the LabX folder. So it needs to be within LabX. You can choose this one, or this one, but we need a raw data LX. I've created my raw data LX. It is within my LabX because, and I can tell that because it's in the same line as my user ID folder, which is also in LabX. And if I compress the user ID folder, raw data and my user ID LabX are in the same indentation. So they are both in LabX. This raw data contains data that need not be submitted when you submit your zip. Therefore, the zip that you create, going back again to remind you about this, the user ID is the one you submit. If I zip up and submit user ID, it does not include this raw data. If I were to do this incorrectly and compress LabX, I would be submitting both of these items, and that is not correct. We do not want to submit our raw data. Raw data is just data that we collect. The final data that we use will end up in the data folder. All of the extra data need not be submitted. It takes too much bandwidth. It just takes too much time to submit, and it doesn't play any part in the map. The map data we have will be in the data folder, which will be included when you submit it to me with your LabX zip and other labs throughout the quarter. Another reminder, these folder connections, for example, D, Spring Directory, Labs, are just folder connections. We could very easily remove them. And to demonstrate that, I'm going to create a connection to our LabX folder. Right now I do not have a folder connection to my LabX, so I'm going to create a connection. I could click on Connect to Folder, go to PC, go to my root, go to my directory, Labs, and LabX, and create a folder. That's perfectly acceptable. But there's another way to create a new folder connection. I'm going to cancel and show you a different way. I can open up my directory and find any of the lab X's. I can find it here, here, or down here, and simply, as long as it's in view, the folder connection, I could grab LabX and drag it up to folder connections. And now a LabX folder connection has been created right there. Now, this holds the same data. There's nothing in data and maps, there's nothing in raw data. This is the same as this right here, but this is its own folder connection. And I can delete that. I can remove it by disconnecting the folder. It's gone, but there are the data itself, LabX folders, are still here, and I can prove that by refreshing. LabX is there, the data and maps is there, and the raw data is there. One point of note, if your user ID starts with anything after an RA, then your raw will be above your user ID folder, and it'll be different for each individual depending on your user ID. By now, you're likely an expert at creating folder connections. You know that you should not right-click and delete anything that you do not want to ever see again, because if I were to delete right here, I would actually delete these. And you are now aware that if you just simply disconnect the folder, it won't be gone forever, as I can disconnect my D, but it is still here. The data is not gone, it's just disconnected. And now to resolve that, I'll create another folder connection to D very simply by clicking on data and clicking OK. And my D is back. My directory is there, labs, LabX, data, maps, and raw data, just as I created them before. Now that we have somewhere to save our map, it's time to save our blank map. And in this case, we're going to save it in the Maps LX folder by scrolling to File, Save As, and navigating to the Maps LX folder within our user ID LabX folder, within LabX, within Labs, within our directory, within our root. The first place I try is Quick Access, because I have created some quick access to these. It does not appear that I have a quick access exactly to the right folder, so I could go to either desktop or this PC and find my data. In this case, I found my data. It's in my directory. And what I might want to do now that I'm here is right click and pin this to quick access. My Spring 2020 directory is now in my quick access. I can cancel, File, Save As, Quick Access again, and I should be able to find my Spring 2020 directory, which makes this a lot easier to save now. I only have a few in my quick access. So I'll double click or single click on my Spring directory. If I click open, it says you can't save here. Please choose another location, which means you double click, and now I can go into my labs, my LabX, my user ID, my maps. Now that maps is up in the top bar, save in maps, I can use the down arrow to verify yes, that it's in Maps LX, user ID LabX, labs directory of my D. It's always good to use this little down arrow, but I know it's in Maps LX, and now I'll name it. And I'm going to name it my user ID lab _x blank, because it is a blank map. But we did actually complete several items, and I'll show you those after I save. I have now saved my map. if I click on the plus next to maps, my map appears. And it also appears down here. Because I've saved the map, these are the same locations, just different folder connections. And notice what we did save. We have map document properties that we've typed out or copied and pasted. We have store relative path names checked. All of this information is now saved so that if ArcMap crashes, or if you're remoting in and the internet cuts out, you don't lose everything that you've done. It's important to save often. We've created our directory in catalog, starting from LabX, user ID, data, maps. We've saved our first blank map, changed our data frame. We have set our map document properties that should be done for every single lab that we complete, and saved the blank map. In the next video, you will download some data to your raw data, extract the data, manipulate the data, and then put it into your map and save your very first map. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please like and share. Feel free to contact me at the University of Washington and comment on the videos. I try to reply to comments as often as I can. Thank you very much for watching.